Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us this Saturday morning. My name is Rahul Himrajani, and I'm the Faculty Director for the JSW Centre for the Future of Law. The JSW Centre was established in 2024 with the support of the JSW Foundation. The purpose of the centre is to expand academic learning, advance research, and inform policy debates on issues related to law, technology, and system reform. One of the thematic areas of the center is AI and the law. And as many of you know, there is a very big global summit that's about to take place in India next month, which is the India AI Summit. And as part of that summit, several institutions are organizing pre-summit events, official pre-summit events, and the JSW Center is one such pre-summit events. We've had the lead up to 3 events this month. We had the AI and Everyday workshop, which happened last Saturday. We have the keynote address by our speaker, Dr. Akash Kapur, today, and we have a panel discussion on AI and governance next week. These pre-summit events are supported by the Institute for New Economic Thinking, and we have Sunanda Nayabidkar, Director of International Strategy and Advancement, here with us. So maybe, Sunanda, you'd like to say a few words.
Sorry. On behalf of INET, it's a pleasure to welcome all of you. Just so I won't be long. I just wanted to give you a brief on INET, or the Institute for New Economic Thinking, for those of you who don't know. It's a New York City-based, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. And the core idea was that society confronts a number of monumental problems, and economics must serve and understand and address these challenges. So as such, the Institute supports economic thinking that's free of intellectual barriers and plutocratic coercion, that resonates with reality and serves the global society. Its global community ranges from students and young researchers to Nobel laureates, and the Institute encourages an open global dialogue that foments critical discourse and welcomes all points of view. INET also supports a dynamic global network of nearly 24,000 young economic thinkers, PhD students, and hosts convenings that brings together scholars, policymakers, and academics from around the world. It cultivates the body of research, builds a community of economic leadership for the future through its YSI, and it also nurtures these goals with a vigorous and technologically sophisticated strategy of dissemination to create maximum impact. So the Institute is creating strategic initiatives and partnerships around the world, in North and South America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. And this partnership is one such partnership. We have a few verticals, and AI, law, economics, and their interconnectivity, etc., is something that is of great importance to INET. These partnerships are integral to the creation of new ideas and the development of a worldwide community. So we've created convenings, both virtual and in person, around the world. And so we're really, really happy, Rahul, to be here, partner with the center. And with that, I welcome Akash.
Thanks. Yeah, sure. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Sorry, Akash. So I just wanted to introduce our speaker for today, for our keynote speaker for today. Dr. Akash Kapur is a visiting research scholar and lecturer whose work at Princeton focuses on digital public infrastructure. As part of this work, he examines the global dissemination of technology and governance frameworks for digital identity, payments, and data exchange. Dr. Kapur is also a senior fellow at the GovLab, where he works on data policy and internet governance, and a senior fellow at New America, where he focuses on global AI governance. He's a former columnist for the New York Times, has written for various publications, including The New Yorker, The Wall Street Journal, Atlantic, The Economist, Nanta, and Foreign Policy, The Hindu, Outlook, and more. Akash holds a BA in social anthropology from Harvard University and a doctorate in law from Oxford University, where he attended as a Rhodes Scholar. We are deeply privileged to have you here to give the keynote talk. Akash, over to you.
Okay, thank you all for coming out on a Saturday morning, and thank you, Rahul, Sunanda. It's my first time at the National Law School, which is very exciting. I got to walk around. I've met so many alumni from here over the years and worked with them, so it's very nice to be here. So the talk today, as Rahul said, will be on the intersections of AI and DPI, which is the focus of the work that I'm doing at Princeton with several wonderful colleagues over there. I do that work at Princeton and elsewhere. I will be talking about this primarily from a legal, or rather, I should say, policy perspective. I have my background, I do have a PhD in law, but I take a pretty broad view of the law. You know, I was happy to see in the recent governance guidelines that came out in India, there's a lot of emphasis on what they call a techno-legal approach, which is looking beyond purely law as an instrument, right? So I was sort of bred by the old Lessig, you know, code and other laws of cyberspace. Code is law, kind of. I believe that many forces act on technology and can influence what it does in society and in our world. And so you may find my discussion somewhat broad-ranging and perhaps even unfocused, but maybe there'll be something, you know, useful in there for all of you. So I want to start a little bit with how I came to this topic, because, you know, I've been working in tech policy and governance for a long time, and it's recently that I've started focusing on DPI and AI. I think it's important for me to talk about that just for a moment, because it sort of sets up the stakes and explains why I think this topic is important. So, you know, the first thing is that I wrote my PhD longer ago than I care to admit on basically on tech and development. And I was writing on digital divide, regulating universal access. I did a lot of my field work in Tamil Nadu, Pondicherry, where I had grown up. And at that time, there was a phenomenon, I don't know how many of you remember, it was ICT was the rage, information and communication technologies. And there was this ICT 4D, and there was this kind of idea that, you know, technology was going to change the world and usher in sort of development everywhere. A lot of money was pouring in, a lot of interest. I think I mean, there were some interesting projects. I spent some time here in Bangalore at HP Labs. I worked with some other things. You know, I think it's fair to say that there were few successes, but broadly that never really happened. And in some ways it sort of fizzled out. And for much of the 2000s, at least, you know, I don't want to overstate this, but I think the internet and cyberspace essentially remained tools for rich countries and for rich people in poor countries. And it didn't really trickle out in the way that we had envisioned it. And so you know, I was somewhat jaded about the whole idea of technology as a tool for development, and sort of feeling that there were other priorities, until I started encountering DPI, right? And probably like a lot of you, you know, I actually came to DPI experientially, right? Like you know, making UPI payments. I think for me, there was like a sort of crystallizing moment in a tea shop in Rajasthan, you know, like somewhere in Western Rajasthan in the desert. And I'm thinking, wow, this is actually happening, right? All that stuff that we were thinking would happen that never happened, now this is actually happening. And so I started wanting to sort of like, I wanted to start to like theorize it and intellectualize it and understand it a little bit. And so that's one of the ways I came to DPI, as this sort of like thing that's happening in the global south and really happening. And I've had this opportunity, you know, I've visited the last two global DPI summits. One was in Cairo, one was in Cape Town. And the location themselves is very telling, that these are happening in Egypt and South Africa. The people there are policymakers, practitioners from Asia, Africa, Latin America. It's a very different crowd, right? And it's got a lot of problems. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it's really happening in a very real way in the global south. Billions of people now using this, making payments, using digital identity. So you know, and again, I should say I have worked a lot on this topic in India, but elsewhere, like I've spent time in Rwanda, which now has a very thriving DPI scene and a new DPI center. So that's one way I've come to this. There's an even broader way I've come to this, which is just as a user of the internet and as a citizen of cyberspace, right? And I need to just talk about that for a moment, because I want to situate this within the sort of broader trajectory of what has happened on the internet in the last sort of 30 or 40 years. You know, for those of you who were around at the sort of founding of the internet, or at least when it went global, many of you maybe weren't, and you came to it as a kind of, you know, Facebook finished product kind of thing. But for many of us at the time, there was a lot of hope invested in it, right? And in retrospect, it was quite utopian, but there was really a lot of that. There was a sort of lot of optimism and a lot of hope in it. And I pulled out this quote. I don't know how many of you know. Oh, there, okay, yeah. So I don't know how many of you know this famous Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace by John Perry Barlow, who was an internet activist in the US. I won't read the quote because it'll take more time than I want to spend here, but basically he's in Davos in 1996, and the US has just passed the Communications Decency Act, and he's very upset, and he thinks this is government intruding on the sort of like the utopia of democracy and freedom. And he issues this kind of like this manifesto, which in some ways is like the first text that really goes global, viral, right? The term hadn't even been invented yet, but it goes viral around the world. And so, the idea really, maybe just like read a couple lines from it. It says, we are creating a world that all may enter without privilege or prejudice accorded by race, economic power, military force, or station of birth. We are creating a world where anyone, anywhere may express his or her beliefs, no matter how singular, without fear of being coerced into silence or conformity. That's pretty idealistic stuff. And I think, most of us around this table would agree that while the internet has been a fantastic thing, it didn't really play out like that, right? What some 30 years later, instead of this sort of like emancipatory vision, what we've ended up with is a series of walled gardens, private, monopolistic or quasi-monopolistic players that control not only the internet in a country, but globally. And so instead of this kind of like vision of a public global commons, we've had a very sort of privatized infrastructure. Various names have been given to this: techno-feudalism, surveillance capitalism. And yeah, basically instead of a public good or a global commons, we now have this thing that's run primarily as a series of private walled gardens. Okay, so why pull back and take that global context, or that sort of broader context? I think for me, the central question facing AI today is this: can AI avoid falling in this same trap? Can it avoid following the same trajectory of earlier waves of technical innovation, which, as we've just seen, began as tools for the public interest, but then end up primarily serving the private interest, right? So, instead of closed systems that are managed largely for the profit of a few, can we build more open forms of AI designed from the start to benefit the many, right? Can we avoid AI becoming yet another driver of misinformation, mental health harms, and extractive data practices, and instead harness it to advance social ends: health, education, climate action, our collective capacity to respond to what's sometimes called the poly crisis? These are the questions that are animating my work at Princeton and elsewhere, and it's somehow the central question that I'm asking in today's talk, because I think the answer to a lot of these questions runs through DPI in some ways. And again, I don't want to overstate the case, because I do think DPI has its own set of issues, but I do think that if we can learn a lot, and we can possibly come up with some affirmative answers to these questions by examining the experience of DPI, both in India, the lessons that we've learned, and throughout the global South. So in the remainder of this talk, what I want to do is I want to outline 3 ways that I'm thinking of the intersections of AI and DPI, and how they can possibly intersect productively, both at a technical level and a policy legal level. And for each of these, I'm also going to outline some of the key governance or sort of regulatory questions. And then, assuming we have time, I want to end with 3 high-level governance or policy considerations. And one thing I want to say about these intersections of AI and DPI is that it's not actually just merely, these are not just hypothetical investigations. This is actually happening. I'm not going to go through a lot of examples today, but you can go 17 kilometers away from here to Koramangala. I don't know how many of you have interacted with Egg Step Foundation. They're doing a lot of work in this regard, a lot of the intersections of AI and DPI. And so there are real world applications and real world investigations of these intersections taking place, which also means that for us who think about policy and law, now is the time to get involved, right? Because there are certain guidelines that need, sort of guardrails that need to be built in now, or that need to be thought about now. And so this is that moment when we can get involved and we can intervene to prevent that trajectory from happening again that I mentioned earlier. Because I think with the internet, we have this sort of advantage of plausible deniability. We didn't know it was going to happen, right? And then you're presented with a fait accompli. Here, we actually can sort of see where this movie is going to go if we don't get involved. So the 3 ways that I'm going to talk about today, and I'll expand on each of these. Let me move. Yeah. So the three broad forms I'm talking about, I call the first one AI for DPI, and then DPI for AI. And then the last one, which in some ways is the one I'll spend the most time on because I think it's potentially most transformative, is AI as a form of DPI. Let me go through these now, explain some of them, and talk about some of the governance issues. So AI for DPI, in some ways this is the easiest of the 3. It's basically using AI to enhance existing DPI modules. So, for example, we might use AI-powered algorithms for fraud detection, eligibility verification, targeting services, welfare services at the most vulnerable populations, identifying, where these services should be targeted. And the AI can do this today, right? A very important sort of use case that's really happening a lot here as well is using AI translation modules to expand the reach of DPI services. In India, we have Bhashini, which some of you might know about, which is targeting low resource languages. This is happening around the world. In Africa, they have something called Masakhane. I don't know if I pronounced it right. But again, using repurposable AI translation modules, get inside the DPI stack where things are already happening, expand the reach to low resource languages and places that have trouble accessing these services now. And so, as I said, these are, this is some sense the lowest hanging fruit, easiest to implement now. It's already happening, which doesn't mean that there are not risks and that we shouldn't be thinking about governance. One that I would highlight in particular is the need for accountability, transparency, and procedural safeguards. So I do believe that AI can be used to enhance DPI and that it's already happening, but we don't want it to be simply a black box that is making decisions. We want there to be some level of accountability or transparency in the decisions it's making. For example, if we're talking about targeting welfare services. And so again, I think this is one area where actually India's recent AI guidelines have got it right, especially their emphasis on the techno-legal approach, because I think that technology, if designed properly here, can play a quasi-regulatory role to enhance transparency, right? I'm thinking about things like building in auditing capacity, data trails for errors, potential misuse, building in contestability, and identifications of fraud or redress mechanisms. Okay, so that is the first category, AI for DPI. DPI for AI is the second form of intersection between AI and DPI here. The idea here is a little bit more complicated. It's that our DPI stacks now contain a lot of data. For example, through payments, through other activities, even the sort of distribution of welfare. And so one of the questions is, can this data be repurposed? Can it be reused to build locally relevant models, smaller models, specialized models? This is the DPI for AI question. And this is a question that I think may be particularly relevant or interesting to countries in the global south, because as we know, a lot of the large frontier models are not contextualized to smaller countries or to global south countries. But we have this data, right? India or any country that's implementing DPI now has a lot of data. And so presumably a lot of this context-sensitive data could be repurposed to build locally sensitive models, what's sometimes referred to as sovereign models. I have some issues with the notion of sovereign. It depends what we mean. If we mean sovereign equals state control, I don't think that's a desirable goal. If we mean sovereign, locally relevant, locally controlled, that's more interesting. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside. So, coming to the sort of the law and regulatory aspect of repurposing data and doing DPI for AI, I would imagine that the governance question, the key governance question, is pretty obvious to most of you who do law. Should I take a poll in the room, or I'll continue going ahead? But I think, obviously, privacy is a major issue, right? Because we're talking about reusing and repurposing data that was gathered for one purpose and repurposing it without necessarily getting consent again for another form. And so this raises really complex, thorny questions about privacy, about data reuse, which is a very complex topic. I actually have worked on data reuse long before I started working on DPI and AI. I think it's more complex than it's sometimes made out to be. I am not a sort of maximalist. I don't think that the answer is, protect individuals at all costs and never allow data to be reused, which is the sort of privacy maximalist point of view here, because I think there does exist a kind of core tension between data as a private good or individual right and a public good and a public asset. And finding that sort of that line and figuring out how to productively and responsibly reuse data is a very complex issue. I do think that data properly anonymized and aggregated does have vast potential benefits that we do need to consider. One aspect of India's governance framework that I would highlight here, and I think some of you might know more about this than me, I've seen several references to, quote, high-value data sets, right? And I think there's some controversy about what this means. I mean, it's pretty clear they want to exclude very sensitive PII. So probably health data is just by default not included there. But what does get included in high-value data sets? How is it processed? Again, technology becomes a big thing here. Can it be anonymized? Can it be aggregated in a way where it's responsibly reused? A lot of thorny but potentially fruitful questions around there. and some figuring out still to do. So then coming to the very final form in which I think AI and DPI are intersecting, which, as I said, to me, at least intellectually, is the most interesting. It's AI as a form of DPI. And in this, in this view, you're treating AI as I said, as a fundamental layer within the DPI stack. The same way we've been thinking about identities or payments or data exchange as kind of core infrastructural components within the DPI stack. Can we also be thinking of AI rather than just an enhancement to other functionalities as an element of the DPI stack itself? And the notion of infrastructure is sort of key here. I don't want to do a large digression into what DPI is, because one of the great things about speaking in India is that I assume most people know what DPI is. I don't have to spend a lot of time explaining it, but I do think that the I in DPI is really a key component of at least the way I understand what DPI is, because it's this cross-cutting, horizontal, kind of cross-sectoral application of a tool, right? We're not talking about top of the stack. We're talking much lower on the stack, like a fundamental kind of almost like a layer on the internet that was never architected in. Sometimes people think of these as digital versions of roads or electricity or plumbing. And so I think that's very much the sort of the I in DPI. So in that spirit, thinking of AI as a form of digital infrastructure, what would that mean? How would we go about building that? There's a lot of work being done in this regard. This is a lot of what my work is focusing on. I think at a high level, one way we start answering that question is by recognizing that AI is not a single technology. It's a set of interrelated technologies. It's its own stack. And then we want to try to identify within that stack, what are the more kind of foundational elements? What are the more kind of infrastructural elements that could provide a platform for public and private innovation to be built on top of it? So to take, one obvious example, applications or user-facing sort of like applications at the top of the stack are probably not a form of infrastructure. It doesn't mean that we don't want to have some sort of controls around them or governance, but it doesn't mean it means they're probably not infrastructure. And the ones that most often do come up are as forms of sort of like infrastructure and DPI would be thinking of compute, data, and foundation models themselves. I'm happy to talk more about these in detail. I'm not gonna talk about each one in great detail here. I would just say that I think on the compute side, there's a lot of interesting work being done to try to create compute that could be provided on a public interest basis. That's not just managed by sort of like the private sector, at least for nonprofit orgs, maybe smaller startups, civil society, academia. Maybe some of you are benefiting from it here. India's the India AI mission now has over 30,000 GPUs that it is offering on this basis. I think that's a very interesting model. We don't want compute to be a privately controlled bottleneck in the AI ecosystem. And again, various other countries are doing this. Morocco has a supercomputer called Tubkal, which it's offering across the continent for similar purposes. Similar efforts are underway to create open data sets for training and very importantly for inference. I think when we think of data and open data, we think of it primarily for training, but the AI paradigm is moving increasingly towards real-time inference. And so weather data, open data, this becomes very important as well. In the case of models, I would just say I think we are heading in a very interesting and direction I would not have predicted, which is that the market and competition itself is pushing towards openness. The DeepSeek moment was a lot of people focused on the fact that it was cheap and that they claimed at least that they did it without chips. Did they actually do it without the advanced chips? I don't know. But I think maybe the more significant aspect there was that it was an open model, and it pushed all a lot, or at least a lot of the companies, including OpenAI, which by the way is one of the greatest misnomers in the history of technology, right? We call it OpenAI, but anyway, it pushed OpenAI to start releasing open models, right? So I think in some ways, like compute and data may end up being bigger problems because, as some of you may have seen with the benchmarking, a lot of the open models now are performing almost as well as the closed models, and certainly well enough for basically any practical real-world application that we may need. Okay, so these are the three kind of broad forms of intersection between AI and DPI. I'm going to end. I think we're still okay for time here, so I'm going to end with three kind of broad governance takeaways that are applicable across those three models, but especially the final one, especially the AI as a form of infrastructure, AI as a form of DPI. I will go through these quickly, and I'm happy to talk about them at greater length if they interest anybody. So first is just sort of a high-level point about the relationship between the public interest and private innovation. Again, I think DPI is often misunderstood as a kind of public sector type thing. Especially in America, I have this problem where I spend like half of any talk explaining P as in public interest, not as in public sector, not communism, all that kind of stuff, right? But for any of us who also know the ecology that DPI came out of, which again is a Bangalore innovation ecology, in my view, this is a very entrepreneurial, innovation-friendly ecology, right? And so I think one of the things that often gets overlooked in DPI, by the way, especially as it's spreading around the world, is this is not a public sector undertaking, right? The whole goal here is to create a certain level of public interest technology, but in order to unleash both public and private innovation, okay? And in some ways, what the internet itself did, it was a public good that unleashed like possibly the greatest wave of capitalism in history. And so I think finding, understanding that relationship between the public good nature of public AI and the private innovation that will actually create some of these applications is very, very important. And we, again, to emphasize, we're not talking about public ownership. We're not talking about public management. We are actually talking about creating better functioning, more competitive markets, which in some ways has been the main problem with the digital ecosystems, that we no longer have free markets, really, right? These are monopolistic markets. So that's one point. The second point is it's somewhat technical. I mean, in the sense of being about technology, it's a point about openness and its relationship to governance. There's a lot of talk about the relationship between open source and DPI. And there's something of a debate going on in the field about how much DPI or public AI needs to be open. So in the case of DPI, should these be fully open source modules? In the case of AI, it's even more complex because it's like open source and AI can mean different things, and there's a whole spectrum, leading all the way up to like, are we actually going to release the data sets that we use for training? So my own view on this, which is not a consensus view, it's my view, is that openness is essential, but I'm not a maximalist on it, and I don't think it has to be open source per se. I think that we take a techno-legal approach and we can design openness as an architecture, and we can design publicness through things like interoperability, through things like open APIs, possibly data portability, which is a very sort of interesting topic. But that I don't think that we necessarily need to think of public tech as being open source tech. I think that there's a very close relationship. Anyway, just to say that is something that still needs to be figured out. I think that if we go take a maximalist position on this, we limit ourselves and we box ourselves into a corner. There are a lot of concerns around the world we were discussing this morning related to security in open source and things like that. And finally, a point on which I think all of you are probably much better, actually, you know much more than I do about this. But I do think that there's a tendency, so it's a point about law in general, right? And especially our existing legal arsenal and general purpose law. And I think that there is a tendency with each new wave of technology to think about regulating that technology and to think about, in a sense, reinventing the wheel. And I think there are a lot of problems with that. We certainly saw this with crypto. There are a lot of problems with this. One of them is simply that law is always playing catch up because technology keeps moving. AI itself is always changing. The other, quite frankly, is regulatory capture, right? And I think it's widely recognized that one of the reasons the crypto industry so much wanted its own regulatory body is because it sets up revolving door and all kinds of things that makes it much more friendly, right? So I think that we have the legal toolkit to manage a lot of these problems. I think of things like competition law, which can play a big role in preventing monopolies and gatekeepers. I think of existing privacy and data protection frameworks, which can be updated and should be updated. And by the way, this is also a point about capacity, because the people working in these places already have knowledge and capacity, deeply rooted knowledge and capacity. Administrative and constitutional law can anchor principles of due process, accountability, contestability, the things we were talking about earlier. So I'm an advocate for looking at our existing legal arsenal, thinking about ways to update it, thinking about bringing capacity within existing institutions, not sort of panicking and rushing and trying to reinvent the wheel each time. So that's basically, I sort of want to end with that. I just want to come back to the point I made earlier, which is that this is a key moment because AI is happening now. As I said, with the internet, we really did have plausible deniability. None of us saw where this was going. I don't think we could have predicted this. And then you're presented with a kind of like ex post, de facto situation. We will have no excuse if this is our AI ecology 10 years from now as a society. I mean, we may have the excuse because we've tried, but as a society, we will have no excuse. And so, it's a very exciting field to be in. And I feel like potentially the work I'm doing and the things we're talking about here could actually really make a difference. So those are my remarks for today. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot, Akash. So we have some time for question and answers. Rahul, could you just, if you are online, if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and I can call upon you. People in the room also can please raise their hands and I can call upon you. Yeah, Arul.
So thank you so much for that really fascinating talk. So just two questions. So one, can you elaborate a little bit more on what you conceptualize as DPI? Again, I'm asking that for a reason because as you all know, even the question of whether UPI should be considered as a DPI is a debatable issue, right? Particularly when we look at it in terms of the IP ownership related dimension. So it would be great to hear from you on what are the key characteristics of DPI. Of course, you mentioned about the public interest dimension should not be equated to public ownership. But again, a lot of the confusion is happening primarily because the key examples which you are using are public sector undertakings, right? Even though NPCI is a not-for-profit company, for all practical purposes, it's a public sector undertaking. So that's my first question. The second one, yes, during the talk, you emphasized at multiple times how good the recent AI guidelines are. Yes, at a high level, I also appreciate that they are actually telling us some of the very nice principles to keep in mind. But would there be much meaning if it also doesn't get translated into action? And if it has to get translated into action, maybe we might need a much more robust regulatory framework. So, as someone who is observing this area from within India and also from outside India, how do you actually see the approach taken by the Indian government with respect to this particular area? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those questions. So, on the definition of DPI, yeah, I mean, I had a whole section on it and I decided that maybe this will come up as a question because you're right, the DPI is a somewhat contested notion. And I think it's an evolving notion also as it's spreading around the world. I guess I would put it like this. I would say there is wide consensus now. What the World Bank calls core DPI includes three functions, right? Digital identity, digital payments, data exchange. And I think that sort of interrelated stack, data exchange in some ways is the least developed of these because it's the most complex. But I think that is like widely accepted as a kind of core definition of what DPI is. Now, what happens in tech, both in public interest and private tech, is everybody gets excited, hype builds, and everything starts becoming DPI, right? So now we have agriculture DPI, health DPI, you know, and so I think there is a risk that what you start doing is you start moving more and more into the applications and platforms, and we're not talking about infrastructure anymore, right? So as I said in the talk, for me, the simplicity and the minimalism of DPI is critical. And in a way, I'd sort of like to stop where we're at, because I think this kind of like core foundational infrastructural notion that creates open interoperable platforms that unleash much activity higher up the stack is very core to the notion of DPI. And you know, if I had a concern, it's that we are moving higher and higher up the stack and calling it DPI. I think of DPI as there's a legal scholar at Villanova, Brett Frischman, who refers to infrastructure as shared means to many ends. Okay, and that's how I see DPI basically. So I think one of the concerns would be, are we remaining in that infrastructure layer? Are we remaining minimalistic? And the other is what you sort of alluded to, which is, for me, it is central to the notion of DPI that this is about unleashing both public and private innovation, right? I mean, I go back to the example of the internet, which was basically built by the US Department of Defense, but because it was an open platform, unleashed the greatest wave of capitalism in human history. And I think of DPI in some ways as just kind of finishing the job in some ways that the internet never did and pushing that up a little more. That being said, I have certainly noticed that as DPI is spreading around the world, governments are the ones interested in it. And it is, especially when it comes to identity, which is a complicated topic. And so it's becoming, there is a risk that it becomes a kind of like public sector tech thing. And then, you know, I mean, I can say that is not my notion of DPI. I don't own the term, and maybe we talk in 10 years and DPI is public sector tech. You know, that's what DPI means, but that's not what it means to me now, right? So I would push to hold on to that. And you're right that a lot of the entities created in India are sort of like quasi, you know, thing. But I think that we can't debate. I mean, payments has unleashed a lot of private innovation and micro commerce, right? So it has created a platform for private sector. I mean, there are problems there, but it has created sort of like, for lack of a better word, new forms of capitalism, I would say. On the AI guidelines, Honestly, I think you all know much more about me than I do. I've read the guidelines. I find them quite like thoughtful, and I find them quite interesting. There's a lot in there. They are just guidelines, and as you rightly say, operationalizing this is complicated. I think countries around the world are having a very hard time operationalizing because the technology moves so fast, and we don't know where it's headed. And we, on the one hand, we don't want to do what I said. We don't want it to become yet another private profit control thing, but we also don't want to stifle the tech, right? And so then you can be like the US, which says we won't do anything at all, which I don't think is going to lead to a good place. Or you can be like, India or many countries which are trying to just keep an eye on it. All I can say is that you're right, that it's a challenge. Operationalizing it will be a challenge, yeah.
I actually would like to follow up on that because I think you said a very interesting thing about digital infrastructure having this enabling quality, right? And I think that is the right idea for DPI, which is this idea that government can use capital in some ways to enable growth and innovation across the public. But how does that sort of square in with your idea of public interest and public ownership? Because again, the different models of public ownership of DPIs, at least in India, and some of them are, something like the DigiYatra thing, which is Airport Authorities of India owning something and mostly private airports owning the rest. And some of it is something like Aadhaar, which is just directly owned by government. And then there's the National Payments Agency, which is again a non-profit. But the ability of these governance structures to be to sort of be used in the minimalist manner that you spoke of is quite challenging, especially because the government in some sense is can look out for the public, but the private sector again needs to look out for other interests. So how does that minimalism square in with that, and also with the openness question, right? Because again, yes, you can sort of regulate openness, but again, the DigiYatra, I don't know whether you're familiar with the Delhi High Court case, which is about privacy and the way that DigiYatra operates. I think the idea of openness and non-ownership in some sense, and public ownership, even not government ownership, public ownership of some kind through sort of something like the FOSS kind of model, may better serve this interest as long as capital is coming from the public. What do you think about, how do you square those two sort of, I think, contrasting ideas? Yeah.
So, I mean, I think it's an ongoing struggle in a way, and it's an evolving situation within the field. For me, I mean, I don't have an inherent contradiction between public interest and private ownership, or rather, I should say there is an inherent. They're two different things. I should say there is an inherent contradiction. And I think of the internet as a pretty good model for this. Like in some ways, for me, the internet was the original DPI, right? It was created by the government. It was a lot of things went right in the early days of the internet, and I don't know if we're going to get them all right here. A lot of the technical founders were not in it for the money. They were basically idealistic hippies, and they created and they really wanted to create this open infrastructure that they didn't own and didn't get rich off of, right? I mean, like they didn't see this happening. And then you had the U.S. government, which has a lot of problems, but in some ways was relatively benign and actually kept its foot out of it. And that was partly because it had capitalism whispering in its ear saying, don't regulate, don't regulate, don't regulate. So a lot of things that seemed bad actually went right in a way. But I mean, don't forget that the Department of Commerce effectively through ICANN controlled the internet well into like much later than people think. Like I think it was 2015, 2016 that the official handover took place, right? So I'm just saying that government can cede public infrastructure. A lot has to go right. You require bureaucratic wisdom as well, which is not always, sometimes it's available, sometimes it's not, right? But I mean, I actually think that thus far, India has done a pretty good job of it. And I think, there are some issues, but I think it's done a pretty good job. And part of some of the actors involved in the creation of this technology were analogous actually to the people in the US in that they weren't in it for the money, they were in it for the sort of public interest objective. So I think it can be done. DigiYatra, I just want to say, I'm not convinced that DigiYatra is DPI. Okay, like for me, DigiYatra is a little bit up there on the like end user application. The DPI underneath there is Aadhaar, right? And DigiYatra is like an end user app running on top of it. So I would actually put that in like the mission creep category. I mean, that's my sort of take on it. The other question was about open source, right? Yeah, I mean, open source comes up a lot, and I've worked with the I don't know if you know about the digital public good, right? There's a sort of effort to now create to modularize DPI as open source modules, and I've worked with the DPGA. I mean, I think I don't have any objection to open source. I think open source is great, and to the extent that we can build this all as open source, that's great. I just think that sometimes open source limits adoption, and sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad reasons. I would say a bad reason might be that a government wants full control, and then they're not going to implement it, which may not, that may not be something we sympathize with. A good reason might be that open source requires a pretty high capacity on the part of government. So if you go to some smaller countries, and you throw some open source code at them, I mean, they don't necessarily have the local capacity to implement that. And so I think, I'm just saying I'm not a purist about it. I'm very much in favor of open source when it works and it makes sense. And there's some overlapping space, certainly, between what DPI or public AI is and open source. And the last thing I would just say, which I mentioned, is that I think when we're talking about software modules, open source is very complicated. When we're talking about AI, it can mean a whole range of different things, and so that opens up different questions.
We have a question online, so maybe I'll take that first. Mr. Neil Pandey, is that right? Yeah. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, Akash. Thank you very much for that lecture. It was very interesting. So I just had a question with respect to institutional and regulatory architecture that India can adopt when it is moving towards materializing how AI can translate into DPI. So do you see, in your experience, do you see a more sector agnostic, a horizontal AI regulatory framework working in this regard, or a more sector specific use case driven approach that uses something like a regulatory sandbox? Especially how DPI has been coming up in a lot of sectors, like agriculture has started using its agri stack. Then there is a forest stack that has come up. So do you think a more sector specific regulatory infrastructure will be more important when you're translating AI into DPI, or a horizontal system works better?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And the easy answer, which is also the true answer, is a combination, right? But I'll try to be more specific than that. I mean, I think, like as I said at the end of my talk, I think so. This is not sector specific necessarily, but it's sort of like purpose specific or outcome specific. Regulatory approaches are sort of the bias that I have, right? So I'm not sure that I would have AI regulated by, the Agriculture Ministry, right? But I think that, I mean, there may be certain sections of it that, that do, but I think, again, like competition policy or certain elements of administrative law can play a pretty big role in this. And so I think the thing that I don't think necessarily works for the reasons I outlined is setting up like an AI specific regulator, right? In the same way that we don't set up an identity specific regulator. There may be bits and pieces of that are sort of quasi-regulated by sort of like new entities that we create. So I'm trying to give a sort of substantive answer to the good question, because I just think that how AI finally gets regulated or governed is sort of broken up across various institutions and across various sort of like existing functionalities, right? And some of it might be sector specific, some of it might be function specific. I don't think it's all coming out of one sort of specific body. I don't know if that answers your question, but I know it sort of circles around it. But that's the way I'm looking at it.
And thank you so much for that response. It answers my question.
Yeah, Rashi.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. So part of my question has already been answered, but could you, I was hoping for some clarification on openness as architecture. So you mentioned that we should design openness as architecture, but that would include, I'm guessing, the open source code that you mentioned. But you also mentioned that data sets should not, at least you are of the opinion that data sets should not be open. But wouldn't that also be a big part of when we're specifically using AI, like what data it was trained on? For example, if we go for any I guess surveillance tech, like to a certain extent, facial recognition, or when it comes to predicting who might have done some crime, like all of that. So wouldn't the data sets, what they're trained on, would be a big part of it? How much racial bias or how much gender bias is coming into the question? So basically, yes, the question would be like, what does it mean that openness is an architecture, and how would data sets fit in, like not having the data open, how would they function?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm not anti-openness, right? Like, I think openness exists on a spectrum, and we should be practical about it. And if I give you the alternative between, if I put it this way, if I say you can use a closed model emanating from a Silicon Valley lab, or you can use an open model that can be used for free, but you may not know all the data that was put into the training there, and you may enter it knowing, we all know that DeepSeek has some weird stuff going on in it, right? Like, I think you can't ask it questions about Tiananmen Square or whatever. We all know that, right? But I'm saying that, like, nonetheless, I would say you would probably still prefer to use the open model than the entirely closed model. So it exists on a spectrum, and we make these practical choices in the real world based on that. On the question of data, I think I had a question about your question, if you don't mind, which is like, when you're talking about the data in facial recognition, are you talking about the training data used? Or I think you're talking about the data that's gathered by the app and the biases of the algorithm, right? Training data, right? So I don't think it's realistic to expect models to use only open publicly available data sets, right? Like, data is a very scarce commodity, and basically anybody building an AI model is trying to grab any data they can. Some of it is going to be open, some of it is going to be in proprietary data sets, and that's just the way it's going to be. And so I don't think that I just don't think it's realistic to say, like, what would you say that public interest AI will only use models that fully reveal their training data? You're not going to say that, right? Mm-hmm. 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 How do, I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I mean, like, sorry.
My question was that you mentioned that data sets need not be open to the public. So my question is, why should they not be?
Why should they not be? Right. Okay. So I'm not saying they should not be. I'm saying that in an ideal world, they would be. Okay. But I'm saying that a lot of these, but in the real world, when you're building apps or when you're building modules, it's unreal. I'm not going to impose a regulatory burden on anybody creating public interest AI to only use open data sets. Maybe there's an interesting sort of nudge in there or an incentive in there that says, when faced with a choice between an open, publicly available data set and a closed one, maybe there's some kind of nudge you can build in that favors the former, right? Yeah, I just don't think, I would love that to happen, but I don't think, like, I think much of the world's data doesn't exist in that form, right? So, it's unrealistic. Like, you're just not going to make that like the precondition, right? But again, I think, like, thinking through nudges to push people in that direction are interesting. Also, as I said, I think I think with data, we're over focusing on training in a way, because a lot of, like, anybody building a model now is probably building on an existing model that's already had a heavy amount of training, or, inference data is actually something we should be thinking about a lot more, right? So if you take, like, agricultural AI, you're going to be training it on a certain amount of, like, crop patterns, let's say, and you wanted that to be contextualized to all these horror stories about, like, African agricultural apps that are traced on European, data. So that's the training data part. But then you're going to need, like, real-time weather inputs and things like that, right? That kind of data, like, if I were a government now and I'm trying to open data, I would be giving a lot of attention to that. What data sets do I have that can be used in real time for models to be using, in public interest purposes now? Yeah. Isha?
No. Right. So thank you so much. It was a fascinating talk. My question is, at the very end, when you speak about the policy interventions that we can undertake, so you talk about how general purpose law is good enough, right? Which includes administrative law, competition law, and whatnot. But my concern is that all of these laws are ex post, so they get triggered. I mean, of course, there's talk about this doing ex ante competition intervention as well, but I mean, it's not. So the main concern is that all of these laws get triggered once the problem is also too big to manage,
Yeah.
right? So is there and then right before that, you talk about how we can integrate openness as architecture. But I want to interrogate this a bit further in the sense that is there a way that we can integrate sort of um, not just openness, but also a lot of values that competition policy and administrative law seeks to protect into the architecture of digital public infrastructure, right? So not violating certain fundamental rights and ensuring that most of these technologies they don't um, end up becoming this leviathan in the end, and then it's difficult to then rein it in, especially in countries where you have political economy issues where certain governments might be hesitant to regulate the big capital and big tech. So
Yeah, thank you for that. I think the point you make about the sort of general purpose laws being exposed is very interesting and very important. I mean, I think you're right? And so I guess the question would be for you all as lawyers who, again, know more about this than me, if we're talking about using, part of this issue here is not just using existing laws, using existing institutional structures, right? Because I'm saying that there's institutional knowledge, there's existing capacity. You want people who are thinking about DPI and competition to understand competition in general. So I'm talking about actually individuals and institutions. I guess part of my question would be do you see a way to adjust competition law, for example, for the digital era, so it isn't all exposed, and so we are able to address some of the risks proactively? That would be one question. Your point that we can't regulate all of this exposed, I think is very valid, right? And so the answer is either we can update our existing frameworks to deal with that, or we're going to have to create some amount of new framework and new capacity, which I think is probably inevitable. Yeah.
this is not a follow-up question. It's a different question because this is what I'm also now looking into. Is have you thought about, so I mean a lot of digital public infrastructure is now going to replace the bureaucrat and government intermediary, right? So have you at all given any thought to how this might change the relationship between the state and the citizen? Yeah, I mean, I don't have a specific sort of questions, a more, but this is also something that I'm looking at. So I just wanted to know if you have any thoughts on this. And
yeah, I mean, absolutely. And that, by the way, that's a sort of in some ways, it's a political science question, right? Because I think we are changing the relationship between the city and the citizen and the state. In the context of this talk and here, I alluded to it in the first category of DPI, in the need for accountability, transparency mechanisms. I think you're right. As sort of bureaucratic decision making gets replaced by automated decision making, we see this across the spectrum in private sector decision making as well. We do need to be thinking about some level of I think both transparency and redress. Those are the two big issues. And because of the constraints of time, I put it all on tech, right? I mean, it's not all going to be solved by tech. I think that at an architectural level, tech can make a big difference. Just audit trails, for example, so that the data is there and we can go back and understand how it was done, are a pretty big deal, right? But it's not all going to come to tech, because then how do you there are these horror stories in GDPR about people they have the data exists, they want to get the data, and they just spend the rest of their lives asking for the data, and then it shows up in terabytes of data on their computer that they don't know what to do with, right? So that's an example of a techno-legal solution that is not accompanied by a real world legal administrative kind of solution.
Yeah, I'm just a member of the public in general interest in this, so I'm not a lawyer. So I have a general question around that. Your talk was very fascinating, the intersection. So the general DPI that we understand is based on rules, right? The payment, all of it A to Z is extremely rule-based. There is no probability involved. Identity is rule-based. Whereas an AI has elements of probability, and you don't know what is the output of an AI and what it is based out of.
Yeah.
Even the designer of the AI cannot tell you why the answer that it gave it in a certain way, right? So now if we consider elements of AI to be DPI, and let's say there is a rogue element in the AI gets it wrong, or deliberately if AIs are hijacked, and some of these AIs end up as DPI elements, what are the elements of regulatory protections that the government should be looking at so that the general public, uh, if it is a victim of a rogue AI or a compromised AI or an AI that makes mistakes, if the public is impacted adversely, what should the government be looking at to regulate this? Because there is an element of probability involved, and it's a black box.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I think that this is an intrinsic issue with AI that whatever, we're 3 years into ChatGPT now, we know this is not going away, right? Like initially we might have believed, oh, this is like a sort of, a rough draft and all these hallucination problems and all that are going to go away, but it's not. The logic, as you say, is fundamentally probabilistic, which means that this problem is not going anywhere, right? So that you're right to identify that. I mean, I think the thing that comes to mind is human in the loop. I don't like what these things will do is they can there's a lot of automated decision making that can do, but you're not going to remove the human decision-making component specifically. And so, you need redress mechanisms, right? Like you're removing a significant, like one way of thinking is you're removing a significant share of the decision-making burden from the humans and from the institutions, but you're not eliminating them. You need them to be there in order to have these redress mechanisms. So you may have AI decision-making, but you need to have redress mechanisms, you need to have appeals processes. And I would just say this is like a huge problem in general, not only with DPI, but with tech in general, right? So we've seen this with payments, right? There's been a lot of like fraud. Where do you go? Who I mean, I don't know if you all have had this, but I've certainly lost 50, 60 rupees here or there when I'm like, I can't spend the rest of my life like chasing this down, and it just goes away, right? And aggregate that across the population, we're talking about a lot of money. But this is like inherent, for me, this is inherent to the scale of tech. If you get locked out of your Gmail account, good luck getting back in. So, like that, there's a human redress problem there as well, right? So I think the minute when we move to the scale that tech allows, these start becoming massive problems. And I think you're right that with, I'm not sure that actually that the scale increases with AI, but there may be a temptation to think the problem sort of solved because like now we have some smart box making decisions, but you're right, the problem doesn't go away and it's still there. So I agree with you. And yeah.
I think just so from if the AI is a private sector, you have two private individuals fighting it out.
Yeah.
But when it is a public good and a general public gets impacted, right? If the systems and processes and the reports are not there, then it becomes a big deal. If
you mean because I mean you're just saying is basically suing the government is harder than
right, because you don't know what
Yeah, I mean the only way to deal with that is institutional structures. It's not like people today are not unfairly denied their rations, right? Or whatever. Like this is part of our society. And so I think you just need to make sure that you have a redress sort of appeal processes. Yeah. Go ahead.
So my question was about how DPI, whenever there are discussions in the government or across the world, reducing information asymmetry is always said to be an important element. And you also talked about the issues around the potential for a private monopoly or digital divide. And I was also thinking about public skepticism around DPI or low awareness and how digital identities become so important and compulsory while availing schemes, and also in terms of how to rethink that information asymmetry aspect. What do you think?
Yeah. I mean, in some idealized world, the notion of DPI is that it actually helps with some of those problems by making government services and public services more accessible, reducing corruption, all of that. So I'm not saying that's necessarily true. I'm just saying that's part of the sort of like selling point for DPI. I think maybe I'll just zero in on the identity point because I think, as I said, when we talk about DPI in India, it's great because everybody knows what DPI is. But the one limiting factor is we tend to equate DPI with our specific manifestation of DPI, whereas actually it's manifesting in many different ways around the world. And like identity is a good example, right? Like in India, we have actually two of probably the most popular identity schemes around the world, which are very different. One is Aadhaar, which is managed and owned basically by the government. And the other is MOSIP, which is a non-profit open source solution that's being used in countries from like Philippines and Morocco and places like that. So I guess I'm just saying that in answer to your question, these are architectural choices that governments make. And I've certainly seen both with identity and with, especially with identity, but with other elements of the DPI stack. Governments have different reasons for wanting to implement these DPI things. Sometimes those are good reasons. I want to spur development. I want to increase efficiency. I want to reduce corruption. And sometimes, whether they say it out loud or not, it's I want more control and I want surveillance, right? And I think the DPI world, the actors in the world, many of whom are my friends and colleagues, we have choices to make about where. I know that most of it will not work in certain places if they feel that that's happening. So that sort of indirectly, I think, addresses some of the points that you raised.
I think we have time for one last question. Raj, you had a question. Oh, you have a question? Oh, no. Okay.
Thank you, Professor, for the talk. I had a question maybe that addresses maybe a couple of points you made. You said that you kind of pointed out the value of moving possibly away from having a general purpose law, and I wanted to ask, in respect of the delineation you made earlier, AI for DPI, DPI for AI, and so forth. I was wondering how we move towards a formulation of that concept, whether it's AI for DPI or DPI for AI, where you can look at, I suppose, the relational aspect or the power aspect that's happening there, and maybe work from there. Because something like, for example, high value data set capture, for lack of a better word, for a public interest, let's say. I would still be a bit confused whether that's AI for DPI or DPI for AI, or maybe both. I don't know. So my question is, is there probably a kind of a bargain that will have to be made in some way, one way or the other? Because even if you go for that new kind of purpose-driven law, fresh purpose-driven law, that will be subject to the same kind of regulatory capture, which we say is competition law and other things are subject to. Or we kind of stick with the same institutional things and try and strengthen it through the existing tools, as you say. Yeah.
So I'm trying to, one thing I'm hearing in the question, correct me if I'm wrong, is how do we prevent the same thing from happening? Is that what you're asking, sort of, or
Yeah, and I guess it's a kind of a pessimistic outlook where, in the sense that you'll have to deal with the same problem in either way, I guess. Yeah.
I don't think that public AI or DPI, these are societal problems, right? These are when Facebook was at its worst, and there were a lot of questions about is it the tech or is it humans using the tech? And the tech may amplify human tendencies, right? I'm just saying that these problems are not going to go away. Problems of power, misuse, accountability, all of that, right? And so, I think the question is can we design? So first of all, are we getting benefits out of these technologies? We recognize that there are risks. We recognize that there are harms. So first of all, are we getting benefits? I think with DPI, the answer is yes. For me, the answer is yes. Okay. And then the question is, what are the risks? Some of which are old risks that we know, and what are the new risks that are introduced? And how do people like us sitting in this room anticipate them, think about them, govern them, draw up guidelines? That's just, I don't know any other way to do that. And a lot of these risks are unanticipated. To me, one of the most interesting things that has happened in DPI, which you all are familiar with, is what happened with the payments infrastructure and the way network effects kicked in, and we ended up with two not only basically monopoly players, but global multinational monopoly players, right? Whoever would have foreseen that, right? The whole point of UPI, as I understood, was break up the monopolies and enable smaller players. So it's maybe we live in a world where we can never escape network effects, and we're constantly playing catch up. I'm giving you a pessimistic answer to your pessimistic question, but I'm just saying that I don't know any other way than to a big thing for me is what I said at first. Is the technology also, does it have potential to cause benefits, right? It's AI, we know all the harms it can cause. I could list them all to you here, but do I also see amazing benefits? Of course I do. And so my interest is in what can we do to minimize the harms and unleash some of that potential? That's my very human, imperfect, non sort of utopian answer.
Great. Thanks, Akash. I think we're just about out of time. So thank you all, both people who have joined us online as well as people who've joined us in person. Thank you for coming on a Saturday morning. Thank you, Sunanda and INET, for supporting this event. And thanks most of all for Akash for accepting our invitation for this pre-summit event. We have another event, as I mentioned, Next week, next Saturday, a panel discussion on AI governance and the Global South. The details are on our website for registration. Please do attend if you are available next Saturday as well. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. If any of you are at the AI Summit, please come and say hi because I'll be there. So.